All of them. All of them!
One of my favourite things to do in my spare time is to mess around with gaming systems. In particular, I love taking something from one game series or a work of fiction or from real life and trying to find a way of interpreting it so it works in another completely unrelated system while still retaining its unique charms. On this channel already you can find examples of me going through all the classes in D&D one by one, finding fictional characters that can fit the mold, and you can find examples of me creating characters based around nations of the world, but until now it's all been very much a character, an individual, one by one. What if I wanted something more? A lot more. Well, with the newly launched Monster Manual just around the corner, I felt, well, here's a chance to do something a bit more ambitious and create not just one monster for your D&D games, but a lot of monsters. And when it comes to franchises with a lot of monsters, well, you need look no further than Pokémon, a franchise with 151... No, wait, hang on, sorry, that's not right. Let me just pull up the correct numbers here and... Oh wow, really? Okay, 1,164 monsters in it, which includes all regional forms, Mega Evolutions and Gigantamax forms. Honestly, that does sound like way too big a job to achieve. You know what, I'm a Gen 1er. What can I say? These games were formative experiences for me growing up. So we're going to focus on the initial 151 Pokemon from Pokemon Red, Blue and Yellow. And if it works there, then hey, we've maybe got a scalable baseline that we can then apply to the remaining 87% of Pokemon. Wow. But if it fails, hey, no worries, at least we haven't wasted that much of our time. But in theory, it should be doable, right? I mean, looking at a standard D&D stat block here, it's mostly numbers, right? And if we look at a Pokemon stat block, well, that's numbers too. So surely all we need to do is just to come up with a consistent way of translating between one and the other, and then potentially we could have dozens of ready-made monster stat blocks ready to fill our games with in mere minutes. Now, elephant in the room, yes, I do know that I'm far from the first person to come up with this idea. There are unofficial D&D Pokemon modules out there, and you can go into the homebrew section of D&D Beyond right now, and you can find dozens of self-created monsters. I mean, look how many there are when I just search for Blastoise. But to that point, I do have the following 3 rebuttals. 1, none of these were made by me. 2, looking through the homebrew selection here, I mean, it's clear that a lot of different people were involved in creating each of these monsters, and they made them independently. Like, no one person has created all 151 as far as I can tell. And this is important to note because if I wanted to say, take this Blastoise, and then I wanted to say, take this Pikachu, well, these stat blocks were made by different people, and they will have different design ethoses and different design decisions going into them. That means there's no telling how they're going to interact on the battlefield and how they're going to perform, and if it's even going to feel like it should feel from my knowledge of playing the Pokemon games. And 3, well, how do I put this? So these monster stat blocks are good, but I don't know, they don't feel like Pokemon. They feel like D&D monsters. I mean, let's take this example here. Blastoise has been given multi-attack because, well, a lot of big monsters in D&D do. It makes sense. But in Pokemon the game, you select one move per turn, one attack per attack action. You don't get multi-attack. Okay, well, let's take this version of Blastoise instead. No multi-attack here, but instead we have Head, Claw. These are not Pokemon moves. So look, I'm not throwing any shade against these creators here. Like I said, these are really cool stat blocks, and it's amazing that they put them out for free over the internet for people to look at, but I don't know, they just don't have that je ne sais quoi that makes them Pokemon to me. Remember, my goal here is not just to make a bunch of monsters, it is to translate as accurately as possible the rules and mechanics from one gaming system into another. And for me, that's where the fun lies in this challenge. Which features port over easily? Which ones do we need to compromise on? And which do we need to ignore or maybe even create completely from scratch? So let's get started. So for those of you who haven't seen it before, this is a standard Pokemon stat block. And as you can see, Pokemon have 6 base stats in hit points, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. The number in each category determines how much their overall stats increase as they level up. Additionally, all Pokemon have a move list. This is a list of moves that they can learn as they level up, or sometimes they get via breeding or training or other methods, but crucially, they can only ever have 4 moves learned at any one time. So part of what makes Pokemon such a fun game competitively is that you don't ever really know which 4 moves your opponent has taken. You might know a specific Pokemon's strengths and weaknesses, but you won't know until they use a move what moves they actually have. And this creates a very interesting element of cat and mouse, or I guess Meowth and Rattata, where a lot of competitive Pokemon games involve a few turns of scouting out their opponents at the outset, switching around and baiting them into moving so they can reveal how they are set up. Now obviously this is very different to the way that D&D is played, and it is something that we're going to have to factor in as we start creating our monsters. Another thing that Pokemon have is an ability. Now most Pokemon have between 1 or 2 abilities that they can gain naturally, and they have another hidden ability which is harder to obtain. Each ability gives a Pokemon specific advantages in certain states of play, and while a lot of them do seem quite niche at first glance, if you lean into them hard and build movesets around these abilities, you often end up with a Pokemon being able to punch well above its weight based on its base stats alone. Finally, probably the most famous thing about Pokemon from an outsider perspective is that each Pokemon has a type, and the type determines what strengths and weaknesses a Pokemon has. So that's what we're dealing with, the building blocks of a Pokemon. So I'm going to capture all of these things, I'm going to bring them over into a spreadsheet where, as you can see, I've got all of these stats laid out nicely as a baseline. So now let's go into D&D, and yeah, it's pretty different, but it's not insurmountably so. And by the way, I'm using here an Evoker Wizard stat block from Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse as my go-to example while I'm building this. It's mostly because this is a relatively recent stat block and therefore likely to be similar to the new monsters that we get next year in the new monster manual. The older 2014 stat blocks tended to be a little bit, I don't know, clunkier to read, let's say. So first up, we have the creature's name. No problem, easily done. Then we have this section here, medium humanoid, any alignment. So in D&D, all creatures have a size, and luckily in Pokemon, all creatures have their height listed as well. So what I'm going to do is very simply take that height and I'm going to convert it into metric because my brain just does not work with feet and inches, I'm sorry. And I'm then going to draw some boundaries. So anything less than 0.5 meter in height counts as tiny, anything between 0.5 meter and 1 meter is small, anything between 1 meter and 1.5 meters is medium, anything between 1.5 meters and 2 meters is large, and anything over this counts as huge. And yes, I do realize while saying this that this means that I myself at 1.81 meters would count as a large creature, but hey, you've got to draw the boundaries somewhere. And this way we can see that, for example, Pikachu here counts as tiny and Onix here counts as huge, which feels right. Next, in D&D, all creatures are divided into different creature types, and this is important because certain spells and abilities only affect certain types of creature. To be really simple here, the vast majority of Pokemon, I'm going to make them beasts, and yes, this does mean that a druid in the Pokemon world would be able to wild shape into a Pokemon after having seen it, but yeah, it makes sense. But yeah, in the Pokemon world, these are absolutely just normal beasts. They're normal animals that fill the wild spaces of the Pokemon world. We see them in the games being farmed for food. We see them being ridden for transport. We even see them being used in war. And saying this, however, there are a few notable exceptions. So any Pokemon that is a dragon type is going to be classified as a dragon, funnily enough. A Pokemon that's fairy type is Fey. A Pokemon that's a ghost or a fossil Pokemon will be undead. And any Pokemon that's a grass type is a plant. Luckily, in Gen 1, there are no instances of creatures being 2 of these things at the same time because that would be a headache to deal with. Additionally, I'm going to make bipedal Pokemon who have fingers humanoids. I'm going to make sludge-like Pokemon like Muck and Ditto oozes, and I'm going to make artificial-looking Pokemon like Magnemite and Porygon constructs. Finally, Mew is celestial, it is a mythic Pokemon after all, and anything which is obviously unable to exist in nature, mainly rocky creatures, these are monstrosities. So let's go to the stats now, and in D&D the stats are different to Pokemon, but there's some overlap here. So first of all we have strength, aka the score that determines how hard you can hit things. So this is comparable to the Pokemon stat attack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank all of the Pokemon in order of their attack value, all the way from Chansey with an attack of 5 to Dragonite with an attack of 134. Now in D&D, stats can range from 1 to 20, so it seems reasonable to do a very simple conversion here from one to the other. So if we assume that Dragonite has a strength score of 20 and Chansey has a strength score of 5, we can then distribute all of the other stat scores evenly between them, and in short, what we end up with is that an 8-point increase in a Pokemon's attack stat equals a 1-point increase in their D&D stat block. Now at this point you might ask me, hey Retrophobian, why didn't you make Chansey's attack stat 1 and use the entire scale, since D&D scores go from 1 to 20, not 5? And well, yeah, I did initially try doing this, but it just didn't work. I mean, there were just too many fully evolved Pokemon with strength modifiers of -1 or 0. It just didn't seem to make sense. But if I went from 5, then it just kind of balanced better, really. No other reason. Next we have Dexterity, which among other things determines who moves first on a turn, thanks to the increase it gives to your initiative. And in Pokemon, the stat which determines who moves first is Speed. So we're going to do the exact same conversion from Speed to Dexterity that we did for attack. And while we're talking speed, let's work that out too, because in D&D all creatures have a movement speed. And generally speaking, most movements seem to be banded somewhere in the 25 to 35 foot range, with creatures like horses able to move a lot faster and snails a lot slower, but 25 to 35 movement seems to be a sweet spot for the bulk of monsters. So let's apply this to our Pokemon as well. And the way I'm going to do this might sound a little weird, but bear with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Pokemon's speed score as it is, and I'm going to divide it by 5. I'm then going to add 15 to the total and round it down to the nearest 5 to give us our movement in feet. Sounds weird, but it does work, I promise, because as you can see, what it means is that a Pokemon like Slowpoke moves just 15 feet per turn, whereas Electrode, the fastest Pokemon in the game, can move 45 feet per turn. Nicely banded. I then do a very simple lookup function so that Water-type Pokemon get a swim speed that's 10 feet faster than their movement, and Flying-type Pokemon get a fly speed that is 10 feet faster than their movement. What's next? Defense. So D&D doesn't really have a defense score as such. What it does have, however, is AC, which determines how difficult it is to hit you, and it has Constitution, which determines how much physical punishment you can take. So I'm going to convert defense to Constitution. That part's easy, but then we get to the tricky part, because by default in D&D your AC equals 10 plus your Dex bonus, but we've already established that your Dex bonus now is based on the Pokemon's speed, not its defense, so that's not going to work. We'd end up with Glass Cannon Dugtrio here being one of the strongest tanks in the game if we went that way. So instead, I'm going to make the decision to give all Pokemon unarmored defense, just like a barbarian or a monk, but with the following formula. So a Pokemon's AC in this game equals 12 plus 2 times their con bonus. So this gives Chansey, who has the lowest defense score in the game, an AC of 6, mildly better than a gelatinous cube, while Onyx, who is made of literal rock, gets an AC of 20. Okay, so that's how hard it is to hit the creature, but what about how much punishment they can take before fainting, aka their hit points? So believe it or not, this was actually a really tricky puzzle to solve, because at first I thought, well, in Pokemon you have HP as a stat, just do the same conversion I've already been doing and Bob's your uncle, we've got their hit points, except it's not that simple, because in D&D, the number of hit points you get is not driven by base stats, it's driven by your level, it's driven by the dice size that you roll roll, and it's driven by your constitution modifier. So we're going to need to work out all of these things, starting with what level these Pokemon are at. So again, I'm going to have to make an executive decision here. So I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, that mythical Pokemon like Mew and Mewtwo are level 20. Legendary Pokemon like Zapdos, Articuno and Moltres are level 18. For all other Pokemon, the final stage evolution will be level 15, and we're going to scale back evenly from there. So in the case of Pokemon who have 3 stages of evolution, the second stage will be level 10, the first stage will be level 5. In the case of Pokemon with only 2 stages, the first form will be level 7. Arbitrary perhaps, but it works, and from that level we can then get the proficiency modifier. And there is one other thing we need to know, the dice size that the Pokemon rolls when leveling up. So in D&D, each class in the game has a different dice size that they can roll. Squishy classes like Wizards get a D6, tough classes like Barbarians get a D12. And this, in my opinion, is where the Pokemon's HP stat comes in clutch, because we can now use the exact same scaling process that we used so far to give each Pokemon a different dice size from D6 to D12 in line with their HP stat, and we're then going to combine this with their level and their con modifier to give us their final HP. Phew. Alright, so what's left? So now we have the 3 mental stats, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So these are the stats which in battle give a monster its spellcasting abilities. And in Pokemon, moves are sorted into 2 types. We have physical moves, hitting things that we've already covered with attack and defense, and we have special moves, which are driven by special attack and special defense. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say that all Pokemon are charisma-based spellcasters. Charisma in D&D is often shown to be force of will or determination, and that applies well to Pokemon who are, let's be honest, also really cute and therefore pretty charismatic. So special attack is going to be charisma, and this in turn calculates the Pokemon's spellcasting ability modifier as well as the Pokemon's spell save DC, which is equivalent to 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus your spellcasting ability modifier. What about special defense though? I mean, there's no room on this stat block for that, is there? I mean, spells do all kinds of things in D&D. Some call for dex saving throws or con saving throws or strength saving throws. There isn't one stat that can be subbed in for special defense. So yeah, admittedly, this is going to be a little bit of a square peg in a round hole situation, but if we consider that one of the most common types of saving throw that you need to make in D&D is a wisdom save, we can do the same conversion we've done before to say that special defense equals wisdom. That just leaves us with intelligence, and you know what? I'm not going to mess around here. All Pokemon get an intelligence score of 10. It makes sense. They are literally animals who can follow complicated human instructions, but the vast majority of them are not able to say anything more than their own names. So yeah, 10 intelligence. The only exception to this is Psychic-type Pokemon, which I universally gave a buff to. So Mewtwo, for example, has an intelligence of 20, and Alakazam has an intelligence score of 18. It would feel weird not to do that, honestly. And now we come to the fun part, the Pokemon's type. Now, we've already seen how type has a small impact of the game in terms of movement speed, creature type, and the like, but in Pokemon, your type really determines a lot about how you perform on the battlefield. So for those of you who don't know, all Pokemon and Pokemon moves have a type assigned to them. There's water, fire, grass, that sort of thing. There's 18 types in total, and each of these 18 types is going to be strong or weak against others. And as luck would have it, in D&D, we get damage types. 13, in fact, which is less than 18, yes, so we are going to have to double up. So let's get matching then. Easy ones out of the way with first. So in Pokemon, we have the fire type, we have the poison type, and we have the psychic type. And wouldn't you know it, all 3 of these damage types exist in D&D, so we match them up, nice and easily done. We also have some very easy equivalents we can make. So in Pokemon, we have the electric, ghost, and ice types, which translates in D&D to lightning, necrotic, and cold. However, I am also going to make the dark type necrotic, and I am also going to make the water type cold. And while we're doubling things up, both dragon and fairy are going to be radiant, and both grass and bug are going to be acid. Flying type will be thunder, and normal type will be bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, non-magical. which, as you can see, leaves us with fighting, ground, rock, and steel, which can all broadly be categorized as the ability to hit things really hard with blunt objects. So yeah, all 4 are going to be force damage. Yeah, I know these types do lose a lot of their individuality, but I don't know, there just isn't a damage type in D&D for rocks fall, everyone dies, so I'm going to have to compromise here somehow. And so if we apply all of these changes to the Pokemon type chart, we can now easily work out what the resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities are for every type combination in the game. Now, because we've doubled up here, this does lead to some interesting situations where a Pokemon appears to be both simultaneously resistant to and vulnerable to a certain damage type. So in these cases, I just kind of treated it like D&D's advantage-disadvantage system, and I said, you know what? They cancel each other out. What this means in practice is that actually very few Pokemon are resistant to force damage as a result, and that works out nicely because force is the least resisted damage type in D&D. So boom, it works. Finally, we come to condition immunities. So in Pokemon, these are the conditions that we have. We have paralyzed, poisoned, burned, asleep, frozen, charmed, and confused. And then there's also flinch, which is like a temporary status condition that prevents you from moving for a turn. And wouldn't you know it, D&D also has conditions, although they do tend to work a little bit differently. So we're going to say paralyzed is paralyzed, poisoned is poisoned, charmed is charmed, nice and simple. Burned is going to count as taking 1 point of exhaustion. Asleep is going to count as being made unconscious and prone, potentially making it the most dangerous condition in the game. Frozen is going to count as petrified. Flinch will count as being stunned for 1 turn, and confused will have to be spelled out specifically, just like in instances of confusion in D&D. And so if we apply Pokemon logic to things, we can then see that electric or lightning Pokemon are immune to the paralyzed condition, poison Pokemon are immune to the poisoned condition, fairies are immune to charmed, fire types are immune to exhaustion, ice or cold types are immune to being petrified, and you know what, I'm going to throw in a fun one for free, ghost Pokemon are now immune to the frightened condition. Next up is the Pokemon's abilities or traits, to use the D&D parlance, and well, there's no easy way to say this. I kind of just had to write these out manually. I tried to make them as close to the spirit of each other as possible, and in this vein, I decided to give each Pokemon exactly 2 abilities. In some cases, this meant I had to use their hidden ability. In other cases, it meant I had to ignore their hidden ability. But we now have exactly 2 for every single Pokemon. And what's really interesting actually is that in some cases, the Pokemon's ability transferred over really well. So Levitate, for example, grants immunity to force damage. Nice and simple. Others, however, involved a bit of creative thinking. So the ability Unnerved, for example, it's a pretty useless ability competitively, that it makes it so that their opponents can't eat berries. And for those of you who don't know, Pokemon can hold one item in battle that affects them in certain ways, and some of these items are berries, and if they are, then they can't be used while the Pokemon with the Unnerve ability is on the field. So what's the D&D equivalent of that? What, can't cast the Goodberry spell? Well, I decided to make the judgment that the equivalent of eating a berry is drinking a potion, and simply said, you know what, while this Pokemon is within 60 feet, you can't drink any potions. Which is not exactly the same as the original ability, but it's equivalent. You can see where the logic is there. And I'd argue, actually, it makes the ability slightly better in D&D than it is in Pokemon. Another frustration I kept coming across is just how many abilities seem to modify another player's stats. Moxie, for example, raises your attack if you KO an opponent. Swift Swim, it raises your speed if it's raining, and so on. Now, modifying stats mid-battle isn't really a thing in D&D. Yeah, there are examples of it, but it's not a core mechanic. The closest equivalent I could find to modifying your attack is the concept of giving advantage versus disadvantage, and so you're going to see that I lean into this hard with the different abilities. For example, Intimidate, one of the best abilities in the game of Pokemon, as it lowers your opponent's attack when you switch it in. So I decided to say, once per day, the first time this creature moves within 60 feet of a hostile opponent, the enemy must make a wisdom saving throw. On a fail, he or she makes all melee and ranged attack rolls against this creature at disadvantage for as long as it remains visible. As you can see, Not exactly the same, and certainly not as elegantly written as it lowers your attack, but I tried to keep the spirit of this ability in place, and the spirit basically amounts to, if you see this Pokemon, you get intimidated and you hit less hard. And with that, our stat block is done. All we have to do now is... the moves. Okay, so at first, I thought about just giving each Pokemon a selection of spells from the game and calling it a day, but I quickly realised that wasn't going to cut it. I mean, while there are D&D equivalents of a lot of the moves in Pokemon, a lot of them just don't exist, like conversion, for example. What's the D&D equivalent of that? Goodness me. So... yeah, I realised I was going to have to make them myself. Now, luckily, there are actually a lot of similarities between D&D actions and Pokemon moves. In both cases, you get one attack per turn. In both cases, you get a limited number of uses of those actions per day. And in both cases, attacks can be either physical or spell-based. In fact, in D&D, there's basically 4 types of damage-dealing move possible. On the physical side, there's melee attacks, which deal damage up close, and there's ranged attack, which deals damage far away. And on the spellcasting side, it's a little different. You have spell attacks, which work both up close and far away, depending on the range of the spell, and you have spells which require a saving throw, sometimes incurring a weaker effect on a fail, and sometimes being an all or nothing. So in Pokemon, we have a similar mechanic in the physical and special split. On the physical side, moves can be classed either as contact moves or non-contact, and we also have in double battles the concept of moves which only target one creature or moves which target multiple creatures, sometimes enemies only, sometimes everyone. So if we're translating these Pokemon moves over, let's apply a similar logic here. So we're going to say physical attacks are either going to be melee or ranged, depending on whether they are contact or non-contact. On the special side, if a spell targets one creature only, it's a spell attack. If it's a status-inducing move like Confuse Ray, it's a saving throw. And if it's a multi-target move like Surf, then it's an area of effect spell with a saving throw. All ranged attacks and ranged spell attacks are going to be given a range of 60 feet just to make things nice and simple. And just like in Pokemon, these moves are only going to be used a few times per day, based on the PP power points of the move. So if we sort all of the moves in order of PP, we can see that the absolute minimum PP a move gets in Gen 1 is 5. In D&D, however, this is quite a lot of spell casts to give a Pokemon in one day. Like, you don't tend to get 5 uses of any spell, so we're going to divide this number by 5. So a PP of 5 becomes 1, a PP of 10 becomes 2, and so on, all the way up to Splash, which can be cast 8 times per day. Not that you'd want to. I'm also going to give each Pokemon the move Struggle on their stat block by default. So Struggle is a move in Pokemon that all Pokemon know, and they use it whenever they have no other moves left. It doesn't do very much, and it harms the user in the process, but they do need it on the stat block, because if I don't put it there, then the monster's not going to have anything that they can do when they run out of spell uses for the day. And finally, we have the elephant in the room, the Fanfy in the room, that each Pokemon only knows 4 moves. Hey, Metrophobian, how are you going to decide which 4 moves to give them? So I went back and forwards on this one. My first thought was to head to Smogon and just copy a competitive list from there, but frankly it made a lot of Pokemon very samey, like all the Psychic types had Psychic, all the Electric types had Lightning Bolt and so on. So then I thought about maybe using in-game appearances of the Pokemon, like what moveset does Gary Oak and the Elite Four use? But no, you know what, that also doesn't work because some Pokemon are only ever seen like once and at a very low level, and so yeah, it just wouldn't be fair. So in the end, I decided to turn to Pokémon Stadium on the N64. Now in this game, in case you don't know, you have the ability to rent Pokémon, so you can battle a friend. Now each rental Pokémon, they come pre-built with a selection of moves. You can't modify it, and you tend to find actually it's not the most optimized moveset. So it felt like a nice leveler for the game. That's the moveset that I took over, and after we combine everything together using a bunch of formula I'm too embarrassed to show, we end up with this finalized stat block. As you can see, it works. You can select any Pokemon from the drop-down menu. They are all listed in Pokédex order, but you can also type in the name of the one you want and it pops up. Hey presto. You get a picture of it, you get some fluff text, which I took from the Pokemon Stadium 2 Pokédex entries. So yeah, I'm going to make this free for anyone to use. So you can pop down into the description of this video right now and you can find a link that's going to take you to this sheet if you want to have a look at it, play around with it, have fun. You can't break it, I promise. I would love to know your thoughts about how well you think I succeeded in my mission to port over Pokemon to D&D. But yeah, a couple of interesting points to note while I play around with this on screen. So point number one, obviously I haven't playtested this at all. I am fully expecting there to be weird glitches and interactions, odd combinations when using multiples of these monsters in battle. I give you license to go out and try it yourself. And if you have feedback, let me know and I would love to incorporate that into a future one of these if I ever decide to do the remaining 900 Pokemon. Good lord. And also, of course, on the topic of playtesting, as mentioned earlier, D&D and Pokemon are ultimately very different games. And honestly, I'll say this now, this is one of the biggest challenges that I faced throughout this task, because while on the one hand, there's a lot of similarities between these game systems, as we've seen, both are turn-based, both only allow one action per turn, both have relatively comparable stats. The style of gameplay is really different. So in Pokemon, for example, it is commonplace, expected even, that you're going to knock opposing Pokemon out in a single hit, a one-hit KO, as it's called. In D&D, if a combat only lasted one hit, your players normally feel a bit hard done by. So I did try to work around this and buff their hit points a little more than strictly called for, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, judging by their challenge ratings, these monsters are not that tough. And I don't know if these Pokemon are scaled appropriately for the game of D&D, but hey, that's not what this video is about. I was not attempting to create a competitive list of monsters here. All I was trying to do is make a fun thought experiment. And the nice thing about doing it this way is that even though you may have made different decisions, even though you might disagree with some of the choices that I made, hopefully you can see that I've tried to be fair, and these Pokemon should all scale nicely between themselves. You can take your knowledge of Pokemon and you can apply it to these monsters that I've created here, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to prove beneficial to you. I mean, that is metagaming, but yeah, your DM might have a word with you for it. But yeah, like, for example, like an Ivysaur is going to be better than a Bulbasaur, a Venusaur is going to be better than both. Everything beats Magikarp. Put a Pikachu against a Blastoise and it's a toss-up. The Pikachu hits harder, but the Blastoise is very tanky. It all makes sense. So yeah, that's all for this video. This took a long time to pull together, a lot longer than I thought. So don't expect another video like this for a little while, but I do intend to come back to this format in the future, looking at other gaming series, including next time, my favourite gaming series of all time. I'm really looking forward to doing that one. But in the meantime, if you have enjoyed this video, do give it a thumbs up. Try out the stat blocks for yourself in your own games if you're so inclined, and otherwise, I'll see you all next time.